Hello and welcome to Leadership Lanes, the Consumer Markets Edition. Today we'll be talking about an interesting topic. Is demand forecasting an art or a science? Demand forecasting is one of the key aspects of retail and CPG planning. And in this episode, we explore how advanced data models and AI bring precision and scale while human intuition and creativity fill in the gaps, especially when dealing with things like unknowns. And to talk about it, we have Andrew Rottweil as a guest. Andrew is the co-founder at ConOps Retail Solutions. He has been a career planning and forecasting professional, providing a balanced approach to forecasting AI and the human touch. He has implemented these principles at enterprises like Urban Outfitters, Walmart e-commerce, and Simple Tire. That's a very diverse range, actually. Welcome to the episode, Andrew.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
So to kick this off, right, what are some of the key use cases for demand forecasting, and why does it matter so much for, especially for retail and CPG?
Yeah, I always look at this as kind of a two-track perspective, and I always lead with the customer, right? A brand, a retailer, a CPG entity, or even a service entity, they're always engaging their consumers or potential consumers with their product and or service, right? So having that balance of that right product, there for them to convert and keep them satisfied and engaged and ultimately repeat, right? Like that's first and foremost. Like how do you enable that to happen? And then I think the other piece of it is like, let's be real here, the financial component, right? If you're thinking about stock to sales and forecasting and timing, if you're running too lean from a stock to sales turn or weeks of supply perspective, you have the probability of walking a customer, right? Whether they're in a wholesale channel or coming to your site, there's that risk, right? And then the opposite of that is if you're invested too heavily and you're sitting on inventory where you can't move for whatever reason, or you're over invested, that dollar capital cannot be reinvested or allocated to revenue or growth initiatives, right? Whether it's marketing or store refurbishing, whatever that may be. And then, the negative impact could be some type of brand erosion, right? If you have to price point or promotion out of that, that could change your customer's perspective and or expectations on that value proposition that you may have once had.
That's great, right? Does that actually mean, is it a nuanced balance between the good old demand supply rule, for example?
Yeah, it certainly is. When you talk about the art and the science, like the data is going to tell you something, but that data is only good within the context of the framework or the time that it happened, or the historicals will tell you something. There's always that forward-looking component, and whether you're talking about seasonality or a change in behavior or trend, where the human component has to come in and say something like, you know what, I'm going to pull my holiday demand 3 weeks ahead of our normal seasonal drop because I'm going to try and gain market share early and traction, which allows me to potentially react further. So there's that dynamic between, supply, timing, and forecasting.
Got it. Got it. Coming to my next question, right? And this we discussed earlier as well, right? Why is demand forecasting often like described as both an art and science, right? Especially when AI models have become much more, I would say, uh, human oriented. So while
Yeah,
that it's there is still art left in it. If I
yeah, I think yeah, that's a really good question. I think the easiest component might be the AI data, right, to describe, right? Because there's a lot of fundamentals there that are tried and true. You're consuming data points that are going to tell you something about price elasticity or promotional impact or turn or out of stock rates or unit velocity. So those things are consumed and we react to them, and they're based on the data that's fed into a model. So the output is as good as the input, and certainly models can relearn and give you a probability of accuracy. But then there's the component that the human's going to have to make a decision on. Are there outside trends that the model is not aware of? Is there an experience, a life experience that a human brings to say, I've been down that road before? The model's telling me to make a 20% deviation, but I think maybe 7% is the right move. And there's factors that the model might not have in terms of a change in delivery time or accessibility, where you can say the model tells me 20%, but I can start at 7 and I can attain 20. And then it becomes a question around risk mitigation.
Coming to the science part of it, how do you feel AI algorithms, especially in today's age, enhance forecasting?
Speed and scale. I can use that example from coming from Walmart. It's really hard to have an individual assess the performance of a 10 to 20, 30,000 SKU catalog and make actionable and impactful decisions. So I think the speed of accumulating data and putting it into digestible buckets where one can assess performance and next moves has greatly enabled individuals and organizations to capitalize on learnings at speed and at scale. And then there's a data quality component there too. I grew up in retail in the late 90s, early 2000s. And believe it or not, there's still a lot of organizations that are using either legacy systems and or still driving hundreds of millions of dollars utilizing Excel and or a Google environment where data is moving and being manipulated in a lot of ways. So AI has really helped the data aggregation and the quality output, but that all amounts to the end result, which is speed. And then you have people, instead of spending 50% of their day setting up data to then make actions, like the script has been flipped, and it's like almost like instantaneous real-time data where you're constantly making the right decisions, right, based on what you're seeing.
Good that you talk about it, right? Which comes to my next question, actually. Uh, what role do you see external factors or unknown or even risks that you talked about, right? Things like seasonality, weather, even market trends, play in AI, especially in the AI-based forecasting? Asking more from a risk factor here.
Yeah, I think outside trends, some of the things that I am seeing from outside influences are multi-channel retailers. You're right. Like if someone is selling on their own D2C website, and let's say they're selling on a B2B marketplace, and they also happen to be in brick and mortar, understanding the different behaviors across the same assortment or like assortment can tell you something about a demographic or a seasonality, right? Because you have a geographic component, you have a digital component, and then you can argue when you talk about like a B2B and a Walmart versus an Amazon, you can start to make some, customer assumptions. So the outside influence is interesting when you get into that compare and contrast mode. And I think, outside factors from an AI standpoint and just a data consumption and output, when you think about product attribution and seasonality and region, I can apply that to my experience at Simple Tire, where the product attribution of a tire and seasonality and timing could tell us how we would have to prepare for all weather tires or winter tires or high performance tires, based on different geographic areas across the United States, as well as timing and seasonality.
Interesting response, actually. A couple of follow-ups on that, right? One is probably the adoption bit I'll take in later. But when it comes to the AI models that are currently there, probably in Hugging Face, which are open source, or even I would say proprietary models, right? How do you feel these models? Asking you, since the enterprises that you work with are very much diverse, right? How easy or how difficult it is for these models to retrofit them into a particular retail use case, whether it is Walmart e-commerce, something like an e-commerce, or something like Simple Tire.
Yeah, I think the use cases that I've seen, and I know there's vendors that specifically work in weather-oriented forecasting, can be applied and have been applied to highly seasonable, impactful categories where the allocation and timing is really important. So seen that in clothing, organizations that are heavy weather or outdoor oriented, right? You can see the impact or at an entity like Lowe's or Home Depot. Like 2 weeks from a weather component when you're talking about snow plows or tractors is literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. So understanding those patterns and predictability really can affect the supply chain and timing. And then, you think about that footprint and how you have to scale and cascade a large category like that. Those things I think are becoming more prevalent and relevant in the AI space, but I think they're the hardest to get to because it's an outside factor and entity, right? Whether not the most predictable, but it certainly has high impact on organizations for sure.
Got it, got it. Since we are on this topic about the models and the positives and negatives of it, right? One quick question, actually, right? In your opinion, in your personal experience, how do companies across segments, I would say, or across, say, for example, small, mid, large scale range, look at AI in general, right? Companies like Walmart, for sure, they are way ahead in terms of adopting it. But when it comes to mid or even small scale companies, do you see approach where they are much more embracing, or is it more like, no, we are just
Well,
investing?
I think there's a few components there. There's a budget component. There's the forward-looking adoption, and that comes down to organizational culture. And I can say that I've seen it. I've seen it, the impact and it being embraced and implemented in both sides. Right. I've been at Walmart, which is arguably probably is the largest retail in the world. So you're talking about literally like a building and an organization that is dedicated to just pure data scientists. Then you have what my team used to be, which was the hybrid, where you had consultants with a data science background, right? So you start to see that mix of like business background, application, data science approach. So yeah, there's definitely organizations either due to sheer size or trying to capture or retain their market share. But I've been with organizations that are, 500 million. Yeah, and they'll have a person or persons that they're either contracting out or starting to develop that muscle within the organization. And again, moving away to that environment where, yeah, Excel and Google maybe got them there, but then they realize like, okay, I now either have X amount of competitors or I need to look to scale some of these capabilities to sustain growth.
Moving on to the art side of it, right? Before we end up the science side of it, where do you feel the AI-driven models fall short, and how do they handle unpredictable market? I believe you touched upon a bit in your earlier answers, but
Yeah, because you know what? Because it's a common theme, right? I think it's the unknown. And I've lived through, in my early days at Urban, 10 years, I lived in a fashion world, right? Where we're either seeing something that customer is telling us or we're actually building a trend. So if you start to see something that all of a sudden is an unknown or hasn't been seen in years or is reinvented, and all of a sudden it becomes a half a percentage point of your business in a week's period of time, okay, the model doesn't may not necessarily know what to do with that, right? So you have to have someone who either has industry prowess or can tell a story and build a case or has outside data, market experience, or seeing signals that the model's not capturing and saying, I think that half a percentage point could be 5% of our business in the next 3 months. And you can grow, and then becomes a depth and breadth exercise, right? And the example that I always go back to, when I was at Urban, our dress category was void of floral prints. Okay, in the spring we brought in 500 units and it sold out in 4 days. Okay, we knew we were onto something, but we didn't know how big it was. So then again, like, the models are not going to tell you much because there's no historical reference unless you have a substitutability model that might infer something, but that's a whole different subject. So yeah, that's where the human intervention comes in, and it becomes then again, depth and breadth, and then how do you test and roll, if you will, into that idea.
That's great, actually, and especially for industries like fashion, where unknowns and unpredictability is quite high, as
Yeah.
opposed to other markets. So that's true. I'll move on to the art side of it right now, And in your opinion, how does human intuition and creativity complement that data-driven approach or the engineering approach in forecasting?
Yeah. Again, human element comes down to being able to understand what the data is presenting you, understanding the competitive or business climate that you're in, and sometimes having to make an incremental and or radical shift from what the current state of play is in where you're operating. And I've seen that a couple of times at Urban. There was a time where we were price point competing with the Forever 21s and the H&Ms. So our data was telling us, within these price bands, this is where you need to be. But then we started to look like everyone else, right? So then the human says, I need to be different. I need to change my value proposition. So I'm actually going to embellish my garments with more value, more nuanced approach, whether it was fabrication, quality, to change the narrative and say, I am different now. And when you talk about models and historicals, they're not really going to tell you that. So that's a really interesting question. I've lived through that at Hair Cuttery, where within our four walls of salons, I had brands, I had attributes, and those 400 items consistently told me a theme and like a forward position. When we stepped outside of those four walls and looked at the demographics and population that we were servicing or not servicing, that was actually the aha moment. We were underserving the Black community from a choice count perspective, and we purposefully started to test and design. So the two products then turned into a shelf, and we didn't lose anything from the rest of the assortment. It was an incremental gain because we were gaining and expanding on a customer that, for whatever reason, prior to my time, wasn't materializing and not connecting. So we were not necessarily a destination. So the human element, I think, is always going to be there, and it comes more that in the area of the strategic thinking and actioning.
Got it, got it. My next question was centered around the risks involved in over-relying on intuition, but I'm kind of tweaking that a bit and asking that, have you come across a scenario where there is over-reliance on intuition or over-reliance on data? And what was the outcome in that case?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Over reliance on data. I would say there was a point in time at Walmart where, the data kept saying more choices, and it actually did this at Walmart as well. More choices equate to more sales. So, and that was a moment of endless aisle. But when you think about the reality and budgets, the data was saying expand in shoes. You can never have enough shoes, but there's only so many dollars to invest in shoes. So when you have a curated assortment, you have a higher probability to have the high sell through that you need and hit critical mass. If you start to go wide and your budget doesn't necessarily allow you to go as deep, you start to sell down and walk customers. So I think, again, like data can tell a story, it can give you a direction, but following it, and I don't know if this is the best term, following it blindly or following it without taking a step back and questioning what are the financial or consumer ramifications, can put you in a position that you necessarily didn't necessarily think you were going to be in before.
Coming to my next question, right, which is more of blending of art and a science aspect to it. I always hear this common complaint generally about data teams or data science teams that the teams are kind of working in a way where they don't know the actual outcome that's gonna take place once they deliver. And how do you feel, right? Again, coming to forecasting is one aspect of it, but this applies, I believe, generally to all the use cases. What do you feel some of the steps businesses can take or need to take to make sure that the data team is well aligned with the outcome or the management or leadership for that matter?
Yeah, I think about, what goals are they working towards, right? Do they know the business goals that they're trying to drive? And do they know the impacts of the results that they may be recommending? For instance, data and teams who are highly analytical and are chasing a KPI where they can never be out of stock, right? Their in stock rate needs to be like 99.9%, right? Okay, if you're driving towards that model, there might be a propensity to overinvest. So I'm never out of stock, right? And that is your only deciding factor in driving that, right? So what can happen is your warehouse gets overstocked. Everything is turning at like 23 to 52 weeks of supply when you can restock in 12 weeks. So, you know, I think there's an organizational component of just clear direction and communication. Like, are the teams and the strategists and the data science team tracking the right KPIs, looking at the forward positions, and actually measuring the results, right? Like, if the model told us something, are we in a good position? Like, is it retraining itself correctly? So I think, there's a cultural component, there's an organizational communication component there, because I have seen siloed teams where they're operating and they're hitting their KPI, but it might not necessarily have the downstream effect, from a financial position within the organization or even an operational.
Some of the closing thoughts here, right? What will be your key takeaway for retail or CPG leaders trying to strike that right balance in demand forecast?
Yeah. I would say be curious about the evolution and learn, right? There's some things happening. You see it in LinkedIn. You can see it in different areas where, there's some camps who are kind of like anti AI because yeah, it makes things more efficient, which can lead to structural changes within an organization. But you have to kind of weight that. You think about AI. I think of it as an enabler. It helps teams operate more efficiently with, again, speed, and good data. But make sure you're balanced, right? Like, have those discussions within the organization. Like, are we applying the right amount of strategy and critique to what we're building and what we are relying on to guide us and make decisions, right? That's going to impact our outcome.
I totally agree with you, right? AI being the great enabler for a human to perform much more efficiently. That's perfect. That's perfect to wrap up the episode, Andrew. Thanks a lot for those great insights. Really
Yeah,
loved it.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.